start Vint, by telling us how you arrived in Laos and what your function was and what you did when you arrived, just casual sort of recollections.
I arrived in Laos in February '62 and started by working in Vinton and then flying up country almost every day. By that time, the agency had made a connection with Vang Pao, and basically as a very junior officer I was running around doing very menial type things. And we did that for about 4 months. And then in the fall of '62, the Geneva Convention was going on. And when it was signed, basically they allowed 2 CIA officers to stay in country. Tony Poe was one and I was another. And we spent a long time sort of trying to find a place where we could move the operations base from the obvious place of Pacau, which is where it was. And I had found this valley with the U.S. aid man named Pa Buell, which is about 5 miles away from Pacau in a valley called Long Tieng. And when I spent about a week or 2 weeks that summer, in the summer of '62, giving a course in community actions or sort of psychological warfare in this little valley, which was pristine and absolutely beautiful. There were about 20 people in the valley, and about 25 water buffalo sat up about 3,000 feet. The irony was that 4 years later there were 35,000 people in this valley, and it was the second largest city in Laos. So in the fall of '62, I set up base in Long Tieng, and we had radio communication with, I guess, about 30 teams who were stationed all around the north. And at that point, it was a very kind of hand-holding type operation. The International Control Commission was flying over daily in white helicopters, and we basically kept our heads down. And the whole war effort, or the insurgency effort, the Mao or the Hmong were working under, was sort of kept extremely under low key. There were no ammunition drops, no arms supplies. It was just basically to hold on to what we had. It's a very tense time because Vang Pao was very certain it would not last, this peace effort. We were certain it wouldn't last, and yet I can say that there was considerable effort, or really every effort on our side, to basically live within the provisions of the convention. And it was very clear that the North Vietnamese were not, because we very quickly learned that whatever North Vietnamese units were in northern Laos did not leave. And so there was 2 Americans basically against quite a considerable number of North Vietnamese. So that's how I got there, and then really for the next 3 years I lived in Long Tieng, lived and ate and slept with Vang Pao, and was his constant companion, and knew the man very well.
Can you tell us a bit more about Vang Pao and how come he was selected, or how come you were working with him? Was he a creation of the agency, or did he exist before, or what was the...
He was not a creation of the agency. Vang Pao certainly was not a creation of the agency. Vang Pao came to where he was by his own abilities. He was an amazingly dynamic man. His father had been a relatively poor man, and he had joined the French army and had risen to the rank of sergeant, the highest, as high as an indigenous Laotian could go in the Indochina War, and had led Mao troops in the Indochina War, and was a very brave and courageous fighter. He was the highest ranking, I believe, he was the highest ranking male in the whole in the Indochina War. And he started, then he became an officer, went to officer school. So by the time the agency got to Vang Pao, he was already vying with Tu Bi Li Fong for political control. And as the military operations increased and the political side of the struggle became less important, his role became much more important. So Vang Pao was in no way a creation of the agency. Now, you could say that the Americans made him more powerful, but he was a leader long before we got there, and his sense of political leadership was really quite astute. It was amazing to watch the man operate politically. He knew what families to touch. He'd married 5 wives from all the 5 important families. He knew the psychology of his own people. He knew what they wanted, what they needed, and what motivated them. And instead of being a person who had been well educated and rich, such as Tu Bi Lu Fong had been, Vang Pao had really come out of the depths of the people, and he knew the little farmers much better than Tu Bi did or anybody did. So as a leader and as an entity, he was there long before we got there.
And why were the Hmong chosen to work with? What was the special characteristics or qualities or things about them that made them the natural people for the agency to work with?
Well, they had had the Hmong had had a long and checkered career. They had come out of China. They had been forced out of China by the Chinese. They'd gone to North Vietnam by and large. Some had obviously come into Laos. But then they had been forced out of North Vietnam around Dien Bien Phu in the highlands of North Vietnam by the North Vietnamese, who feared them because they were very independent and fundamentally politically uncontrollable. And they had arrived in Laos. The largest migration of them had arrived in Laos in the latter part of the 1900s. The 1800s. And they had a fierce sense of their own independence. My sense of Laotian history is a little bit vague at this point. It's been a long time. But in the turn of the century, at some point, either in the late 1890s or the early 1900s, there was an invasion of Laos by the North Vietnamese. And the Hmong around the province of Giang Quang created a guerrilla movement to fight the people who had just kicked them out of North Vietnam. The then king, was so worried about the survival of Laos that he formed, in effect, a kind of paternal alliance with the Hmong, and in effect guaranteed them, or if not guaranteed them, but allowed them to create a political entity which they had never had before. And what is kind of interesting is that the political organization of the towns and villages and the forces that we later worked with were almost identical with the earlier organization that had fought the North Vietnamese some 50 or 60 years before. It also explains why the Hmong of Giang Quang province were politically so more advanced than the Hmong anywhere else in Laos. Anywhere else in Laos, the Hmong existed really as individual villages with very little connection between the villages. And in Giang Quang, it was all very, very organized into sort of tasangs, which are districts, and then they were the whole province had a leader. So we used, in effect, a political organization which had already been intact.
How many troops were involved at the very beginning?
The number of troops that were involved in the very beginning, well, were only several companies, obviously, and then it grew. By the time I started working with them in 1962, I think there were perhaps maybe 10 or 12,000. I think we'd armed about that many. I may be wrong, but not, give or take, something. I think by the time I left, which was just about at the top of when it was the movement was at its most powerful. I think there were about 25,000. So we armed quite a few between the years of 1964 to 66 and 67.
Can you explain why it was there were never any case officers killed in Laos?
Well, there were case officers killed.